Maximum sentence. Those 4 words hang in the air of courtroom 4B like a death sentence for the future. The judge's gavel hasn't even fallen yet when the 19-year-old defendant does something that makes the entire courtroom freeze. He reaches into his pocket, slowly, deliberately. The bailiffs tense. The prosecutor half rises from his chair. Everyone in that room is thinking the same thing. This is the moment when rage takes over, when a young man with nothing left to lose makes one final, terrible decision. But what happens next isn't what anyone expected. Not the judge who's been on the bench for 23 years. Not the prosecutor who's seen hundreds of sentencings. Not the defense attorney who thought she knew her client. And definitely not the mother sitting in the gallery, already broken by grief. What this young man does in the next 60 seconds will challenge everything you think you know about justice, redemption, and what it means to take responsibility for the worst mistake of your life. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, and the phone call that changed courtroom protocol forever. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand who Marcus Thompson was before that sentencing hearing. Born in South Memphis to a single mother who worked 2 jobs, Marcus was what teachers called bright but troubled, a kid with potential that kept getting buried under the weight of poverty, peer pressure, and limited options. By 16, he'd dropped out of high school. By 17, he was running with a crew that dealt drugs on the corner of his block. By 18, he'd been arrested twice for possession. And by 19, he'd made the decision that would define the rest of his life. On the night of April 3, 2023, Marcus and 2 associates attempted to rob a convenience store in downtown Memphis. The plan was simple, stupid, and doomed from the start. Get in, get the cash, get out. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. But plans that start with "nobody gets hurt" in a robbery almost never end that way. The store clerk, a 54-year-old father of 3 named David Chen, reached for the silent alarm. One of Marcus's associates panicked and fired a weapon. The bullet struck Mr. Chen in the shoulder. He survived, but the injury would require 3 surgeries and months of physical therapy. His medical bills exceeded $200,000. His ability to work was permanently compromised, and his sense of safety in the store he'd run for 15 years was shattered beyond repair. Marcus didn't pull the trigger. The law is clear on this. He was guilty of felony murder because the shooting happened during the commission of a felony he participated in. His 2 associates fled and were eventually caught in different states. Marcus was arrested the next morning at his mother's apartment, where he'd returned because he literally had nowhere else to go. During the interrogation, he did something unusual for someone his age facing serious charges. He confessed. Completely. No lawyer present yet, no Miranda warnings read, just a 19-year-old kid who looked at the detectives across that metal table and said, "I did it. I was there." That confession would become central to his case, but not in the way most people expect. His public defender, a woman named Sarah Martinez, who'd been overworked and underpaid for a decade but still believed in the possibility of redemption, argued that the confession showed something important about Marcus's character. "My client made a terrible choice," she told the jury during the trial. But when faced with the consequences, he didn't run from them. He didn't lie. He didn't try to minimize what he'd done. The trial lasted 6 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed Marcus entering the store. Fingerprints confirmed his presence. His own confession sealed his fate. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of armed robbery and felony assault. Mr. Chen testified during the trial, his arm still in a sling, describing the moment he thought he was going to die in his own store. His wife testified about the nightmares her husband still suffered, about the way he flinched at sudden movements, about the medical debt that was drowning their family. Marcus sat at the defense table throughout the trial with his head down, occasionally wiping tears from his eyes but never looking away when the victims testified. His mother, Teresa, sat in the gallery every single day, a silent figure in the back row whose presence seemed to shrink a little more with each damning piece of evidence. When the verdict was read, Marcus didn't react with surprise or anger. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd already known. His attorney squeezed his shoulder. His mother buried her face in her hands. And the next phase began: sentencing. Sentencing hearings are where the human cost of crime becomes impossible to ignore. It's where victims get to speak, where families beg for mercy, where judges weigh justice against rehabilitation and public safety against redemption. Marcus's sentencing hearing was scheduled for June 15, 2023, 2 months after the verdict. In those 2 months, Sarah Martinez worked tirelessly to present a case for leniency. She compiled letters from Marcus's former teachers describing a bright student who'd gotten lost. She brought in a psychologist who testified about the impact of poverty and trauma on adolescent decision-making. She presented evidence that Marcus had been taking GED classes while in jail awaiting trial. She argued that a young man who'd taken immediate responsibility for his actions deserved a chance at rehabilitation, not just punishment. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Robert Hayes, presented a different narrative. They brought back Mr. Chen, whose physical recovery was ongoing, but whose emotional scars seemed permanent. They presented statistics about recidivism rates for violent offenders. They argued that the community needed to be protected, that leniency would send the wrong message, that Marcus Thompson had made choices that required serious consequences. This wasn't a mistake, Hayes told the judge during his closing arguments. This was a violent crime that left a man permanently disabled and a family financially destroyed. The defendant's remorse, while perhaps genuine, doesn't undo that harm. Judge Patricia Morrison had presided over the trial and would now decide Marcus's fate. At 61, she'd seen every variation of human tragedy and criminality that a courtroom could offer. She'd sentenced first-time offenders and career criminals, teenagers and grandparents, people who showed remorse and people who showed nothing but contempt. She was known as tough, but fair, a judge who followed the law but tried to see the human being standing before her bench. The sentencing guidelines for Marcus's crimes ranged from 10 to 25 years. His future was entirely in her hands. The hearing began at 9 a.m. Mr. Chen spoke first, his voice shaking but determined. "I don't hate Marcus Thompson," he said, looking directly at the young man who'd been part of the crew that changed his life forever. "I don't wish him harm, but I can't lift my daughter anymore. I can't do the physical work my store requires. I lie awake at night replaying those moments, wondering if I'm going to die. That doesn't go away because someone says they're sorry." Marcus's mother was next. Teresa Thompson, 42 years old but looking a decade older from the weight of poverty and worry, approached the microphone with a letter she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. "I know my son did something terrible," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know he hurt people. I know he deserves to be punished. But, Your Honor, he's still my baby. He's the boy who used to walk me home from work at night to keep me safe. He's the son who gave me his last $20 when I couldn't make rent. He made a horrible choice, but he's not a horrible person." By the end, she was sobbing. Marcus was crying at the defense table. Even the bailiffs looked uncomfortable. Sarah Martinez made her final plea, emphasizing Marcus's age, his lack of prior violent offenses, his immediate acceptance of responsibility, and the possibility of rehabilitation. Robert Hayes countered that the severity of the crime demanded a strong response, that public safety required serious consequences, that the victim's suffering couldn't be minimized. And then Judge Morrison asked Marcus if he wanted to make a statement before sentencing. This is the moment that lawyers dread and pray for in equal measure. A defendant's statement can humanize them or damn them further. It can show genuine remorse or reveal the absence of it. Marcus stood, his hands shaking, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of his current status. "I don't have good words," he began. "I'm not a speaker, but I need to say this. Mr. Chen, I'm sorry. Those words aren't enough. I know they're not enough, but they're all I have. Every day in that cell, I think about what I did to you, to your family. I think about how I threw away my life and damaged yours for what? For nothing. For money I didn't even keep. I was stupid and selfish, and I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I know I'm going to prison. I know I deserve it. I just want you to know that I will spend every day trying to be the person my mama raised me to be, not the person I became on that night." Judge Morrison asked him to sit. The courtroom went silent as she reviewed her notes, as she considered the law, the facts, the testimony, the human beings before her. Everyone waited. The clock on the wall ticked, and then she spoke. "Mr. Thompson, I've presided over this case from its inception. I've heard the evidence. I've listened to the testimony of the victim whose life you helped destroy. I've listened to your mother's plea for mercy. I've considered your age, your background, your apparent remorse." Judge Morrison paused, and in that pause, you could hear the entire courtroom holding its breath. "The law requires me to impose a sentence that serves justice, protects the community, and hopefully provides you an opportunity for rehabilitation. After careful consideration, I am sentencing you to the maximum sentence allowed under the guidelines." The words hit like a physical blow. Marcus's head dropped. His mother's wail cut through the courtroom silence. Sarah Martinez closed her eyes. The maximum sentence, not the minimum, not somewhere in the middle. The absolute maximum the judge could legally impose. 15 years. Marcus would be 34 years old when he became eligible for parole. His 20s, the years when most people build their lives, start careers, form families, would be spent behind bars. But before the gavel could fall, before the bailiffs could approach to take him away, Marcus did something no one expected. He reached into the pocket of his jumpsuit, slowly, deliberately, in a way that made every law enforcement officer in that room tense. The bailiff nearest to him moved forward, hand on his restraints. The prosecutor stood up. Even Judge Morrison leaned forward, her expression shifting from judicial authority to genuine concern. Marcus pulled out a folded piece of paper and a small pencil. Not a weapon, not a threat, just paper and pencil. The only possessions inmates are allowed to keep on their person during court proceedings. And then he did something even more unexpected. He looked directly at Judge Morrison and said, "Your Honor, before they take me, can I make one phone call? Please?" The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Phone calls aren't typically granted during sentencing hearings. It's not procedure. It's not protocol. But Judge Morrison, who'd seen almost everything in her 23 years on the bench, had never seen this exact request. She could have said no. She probably should have said no. But something about Marcus's expression, not defiance, not anger, just desperate urgency, made her pause. "To whom do you need to call, Mr. My little brother, ma'am. He's 13. He's at school right now. I need to talk to him before they take me away for all those years." Marcus's voice cracked on that last word. "I promised him I'd call today. He's been waiting to hear the sentence. I need to tell him myself before he hears it from someone else." Judge Morrison should have said no. Every instinct of judicial procedure said no. But she looked at this 19-year-old kid standing before her, facing 15 years of incarceration, making one last desperate request to talk to his little brother, and she made a decision that would be discussed in legal circles for years afterward. "Bailiff, hand him the courtroom phone. Mr. Thompson, you have 2 minutes, and this conversation will be on speaker so everyone in this courtroom can hear it." Marcus nodded. The bailiff, looking uncertainly at the judge, unplugged the courtroom phone from its base and carried it to the defense table. The cord was just long enough for Marcus to hold the receiver. His hands were shaking so badly that Sarah Martinez had to help him dial the number he'd written on that piece of paper. The phone rang. Once. Twice. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the dial tone between rings. 3 times. And then a young voice answered. The voice was high, uncertain, clearly belonging to a child. Jaden? The defendant's voice was thick with emotion. Marcus, what did the judge say? The hope in that young voice was heartbreaking. Marcus closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his cheek. No, little man, I'm not coming home. Not for a long time. There was silence on the other end. You could hear the boy processing this information, this reality that his big brother, probably his hero, his protector, wouldn't be coming home until he was 28 years old. 15 years? That's... I know, Jaden. Marcus was crying openly now, not caring that everyone in the courtroom was watching. But I need you to listen to me, okay? This is important. The voice was small, broken. I messed up, little brother. I made bad choices, really bad choices, and now I have to pay for those choices. But you don't have to make the same mistakes I did. Marcus's voice grew stronger, more urgent. You stay in school. You stay away from the guys on the corner. You stay away from everything that got me in here. Promise me, Jaden. But I don't have nobody to look after me now. Mama's always working, and you were... I know. I know I was supposed to be there for you. I know I let you down. That's why you gotta be strong without me. Marcus looked up at the ceiling, fighting to keep his composure. Mama's gonna need help. You gotta step up. Do your homework. Stay out of trouble. Make me proud, Jaden. Make yourself proud. The boy's voice came back, trembling, but determined. I promise, Marcus. I love you, little brother. I'm so sorry I won't be there to see you grow up, but I'll be thinking about you every single day. Every single day. You remember that. And when you're making a choice, a hard choice, you think about where I am right now. You think about this phone call. And you choose better than I did. Okay. I gotta go now. Be good, little man. Marcus handed the phone back to the bailiff. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of muffled crying, from Teresa Thompson in the gallery, from Sarah Martinez at the defense table, from at least 3 jurors who'd stayed to observe the sentencing. Even Mr. Chen, the victim, was wiping his eyes. Judge Morrison sat motionless at her bench, her professional composure visibly shaken. Marcus turned back to face the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Morrison took a moment to compose herself before speaking. Her voice, when it came, was different than it had been before, softer, more personal. Mr. Thompson, that was perhaps the most honest moment of accountability I've seen in this courtroom. You didn't use that phone call to proclaim your innocence. You didn't use it to blame others for your situation. You used it to try to save your brother from making your mistakes. She paused, then added something unprecedented. I am going to make a recommendation to the parole board that you be considered for early release after 10 years, contingent upon your behavior and your participation in rehabilitation programs. That is not a guarantee, Mr. Thompson. That is an opportunity. The shift in the courtroom was palpable. 15 years with consideration for parole at 10 instead of 12.7 was still a devastating sentence. But it was also a glimmer of hope where there had been none. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. The bailiffs approached, the handcuffs went on, and as Marcus Thompson was led from the courtroom to begin serving his sentence, he looked back once at his mother. He mouthed it back, and then he was gone. That courtroom phone call became something larger than anyone could have anticipated. Someone in the gallery had recorded it on their phone, technically against court rules, but never prosecuted. The audio was posted online that evening. By the next morning, it had been viewed over 3 million times. By the end of the week, It had sparked a national conversation about sentencing, rehabilitation, accountability, and what it means when young people take responsibility for their actions. Legal scholars debated whether Judge Morrison had acted appropriately in allowing the phone call. Some argued it was a violation of procedure that could have jeopardized the sentencing. Others praised it as a moment of judicial humanity that recognized the person behind the crime. The consensus eventually was that while unorthodox, the judge's decision hadn't violated any laws and had provided insight into the defendant's character that was relevant to sentencing considerations. But the real impact was on people who heard that phone call. Youth counselors began using it in intervention programs, playing it for teenagers who were heading down the same path Marcus had taken. "Listen to what bad choices cost," they'd say. Churches used it in sermons about redemption and consequences. Schools incorporated it into programs about decision-making. Jaden Thompson, the 13-year-old on the other end of that phone call, became something of a symbol himself. Local news outlets interviewed him, with his mother's permission and his face obscured, 6 months after the sentencing. He was still in school. His grades had improved. He'd joined the basketball team and was working with a mentor through a community program. "I think about that phone call every day," he said. "I think about my brother in prison, and I think about the promise I made him. I'm going to keep that promise." Teresa Thompson, Marcus's mother, started speaking at community events about the warning signs she'd missed, about the importance of parental involvement despite economic hardship, about the devastating cost of gang culture on families. She didn't excuse her son's actions, she was clear about that, but she used their story to try to prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. "I lost my son for 15 years, she'd tell audiences. "He's alive, but he's gone. And every day I wonder what I could have done differently. I'm telling you now, pay attention to your kids. I don't care how tired you are, how many jobs you're working, how hard life is. Pay attention." Mr. Chen, the victim, gave his own statement to the media a year after the sentencing. His physical recovery had been slower than hoped, but he'd returned to working in his store, though now with a security guard present during evening hours. "I watched that young man take accountability in a way I didn't expect," Chen said. "Does it change what happened to me? No, I still live with pain every day. But I think about that phone call he made to his brother. I think about him trying to save that boy from his own mistakes. That takes courage." Marcus Thompson, 2 years into his sentence, has completed his GED. He's enrolled in vocational training programs offered through the prison. He's participated in restorative justice circles where he's spoken with other victims of violent crime. He writes letters to his brother every week, letters full of encouragement, advice, and reminders to stay on the right path. Jaden saves every letter, and Marcus has had only one disciplinary incident for giving his food tray to another inmate who hadn't eaten in 2 days. Even that violation showed the person he's trying to become. The parole board will consider Marcus's case in 8 more years. There's no guarantee he'll be released at 10 years instead of 12.7. That will depend on his behavior, his rehabilitation, his demonstrated remorse, and his realistic plan for reintegration. But he has something many inmates don't have, a clear motivation to change. Every time he's tempted to give up, to fall into the prison culture that can destroy whatever humanity someone has left, he thinks about that phone call. He thinks about his brother's voice. He thinks about the promise Jaden made and the promise he made in return, to become someone worthy of that faith. Marcus Thompson made a terrible choice on April 3, 2023. He participated in a violent crime that left a man permanently injured and a family financially destroyed. No amount of remorse erases that harm. No phone call undoes that damage. Justice required consequences, and Marcus is paying those consequences with 15 years of his life. But in that courtroom, in those 2 minutes on the phone with his little brother, Marcus did something profound. He took complete ownership of his actions. He didn't blame poverty or peer pressure or difficult circumstances. He didn't ask for sympathy. He used what might have been his last free moments to try to save his brother from repeating his mistakes. And in doing so, he showed that even people who've committed serious crimes can still have humanity, can still care about others, can still be capable of growth and change. This story isn't about excusing criminal behavior. It's not about minimizing the harm caused to victims. It's about recognizing that justice can include both accountability and the possibility of redemption. It's about understanding that 19-year-olds, while legally adults, are still developing, still capable of learning from catastrophic mistakes. And it's about the power of taking responsibility, real, genuine responsibility, for the harm we cause. That phone call changed courtroom protocol in at least 12 jurisdictions that now have formal policies about last contact with family members before sentencing. It changed intervention programs across the country. And it changed the trajectory of at least one 13-year-old boy who might have followed his brother's path, but instead chose differently because he'd been given a reason to choose differently. If you're a young person watching this, here's what I want you to take away. Marcus Thompson is spending the best years of his life in prison because he made bad choices. One night of terrible decisions has cost him 15 years. Think about that. Think about what 15 years means. Think about everything you want to do in the next 15 years. The people you want to meet, the experiences you want to have, the life you want to build. Now imagine all of that happening in a cell. That's the reality of bad choices. Don't let anyone tell you that criminal behavior doesn't have consequences. Don't let anyone convince you that you're too smart to get caught or too tough to care. Marcus thought all those things too. If you're a parent watching this, pay attention to your kids. I know you're tired. I know you're working hard to provide. But your presence matters more than your presence. Your attention matters more than your absence, no matter how justified that absence might be. Teresa Thompson is a good mother who worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her children. But she missed the signs that Marcus was heading toward disaster. Learn from her pain. And if you're someone who believes in second chances, who thinks the criminal justice system should include rehabilitation along with punishment, share this story. Share it not because Marcus Thompson deserves sympathy, he's receiving exactly the consequences his actions warranted, but because his story shows that even people who've committed serious crimes can demonstrate the capacity for change. That doesn't mean they shouldn't face consequences. It means those consequences should include opportunities for them to become better people than they were at their worst moment. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about justice and redemption, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe a young person making questionable choices. Maybe a parent who needs to pay more attention. Maybe someone who's lost hope that people can change. Drop a comment telling me what you think about sentencing, about accountability, about second chances. I want to hear from you. And subscribe to this channel because we tell stories that matter, stories that challenge easy answers, stories about real people facing real consequences, and sometimes, finding redemption in the midst of justice. Marcus Thompson said, "I'm sorry," to his victim. He said, "I love you," to his brother. And he said, "I'll try to be better," to himself. Now he's got 13 more years to prove whether those words meant anything. We'll be here to tell you how that story ends. Stay tuned.